I took a job at the old metal factory on the edge of town. It was supposed to be temporary, a filler job until something better came along. The factory was a relic from another era, its once bustling machines now rusted and creaky. The foreman, a grizzled old man named Roy, didn't ask many questions. He just told us what to do and made sure we did it. And for a while, it was just a job. Until the night shift rotation started. I remember the first night like it was yesterday. The air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and grease. The machines groaned as they moved, like they were protesting their own existence. I was working the grinder, making sure the metal sheets were smooth and uniform, when I noticed something strange. There was a door at the far end of the factory floor, one I hadn't seen before. It was made of thick steel, bolted shut with a massive lock. When I asked Roy about it, he just shook his head and told me to mind my own business, but curiosity got the best of me. Every night, I found myself glancing at that door, wondering what was behind it. One night, after the others had left and I was finishing up, I decided to take a closer look. The factory was eerily quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of machinery and the occasional clang of metal. I made my way to the door and noticed that the lock was old, rusted, and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I don't know what possessed me, but I grabbed a crowbar from the tool bench and started prying at the lock. It took a few minutes, but eventually, the rusted metal gave way with a loud snap. The door creaked open, revealing a set of stairs leading down into the darkness. A chill ran down my spine, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what was down there. I grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of damp earth and rust filled my nostrils. At the bottom of the stairs, I found another door, this one made of wood and barely hanging on its hinges. I pushed it open and stepped into a large, dimly lit room. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was filled with old, rusted machines, the kind you'd expect to see in a factory decades ago. But what really caught my attention were the stains on the floor, dark, almost black, and splattered across the concrete like someone had thrown paint. But this wasn't paint. It was something else, something I didn't want to think about. As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I heard a noise, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the shadows at the far end of the room. I swung my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. Just more old machines and piles of scrap metal. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The shuffling grew louder, and I could see something moving in the darkness, just out of the reach of my flashlight. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response, just that constant, maddening shuffling. And then suddenly it stopped. The room was deathly silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, and I started to back away. But before I could move, something grabbed me from behind. I spun around, dropping my flashlight in the process. The light rolled across the floor, casting erratic shadows on the walls. I could barely see, but I felt the cold, clammy grip of a hand on my arm. I pulled away, stumbling back, and saw the figure. An old man. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with that dead-eyed gaze. And then he pointed, his finger trembling towards the far corner of the room. I didn't want to look, didn't want to know what he was pointing at, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned and saw a small pile of bones, human bones, scattered across the floor. My mind raced, trying to piece together what I was seeing. The factory, the locked door, the stains on the floor, it all started to make sense in a horrifying way. This place wasn't just a factory. It was a graveyard, a place where men had died, their bodies left to rot, their souls trapped in this hellish place. I turned back to the old man, but he was gone, vanished into thin air. The shuffling sound started up again, louder this time, echoing through the room. I knew I had to get out of there, but my legs felt like lead. I stumbled back towards the stairs, grabbing my flashlight on the way, and bolted up the steps two at a time. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. I could still hear the shuffling behind me, the faint sound of whispers carried on the wind. I didn't look back, didn't want to see what might be following me. The next day, I quit my job. I didn't give a reason, didn't tell anyone what I had seen. Who would believe me? But I still think about it sometimes, especially at night. I think about those bones, about that old man, and I wonder how many other places like this are out there. I've been a long haul trucker for over 20 years now, and I've seen my fair share of weird stuff out on the open road. From strange lights in the sky to deserted gas stations that seem to appear and disappear at random. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on Route 66 last fall. It was supposed to be an easy run, just a straight shot from Oklahoma City to Flagstaff. I had done the route 100 times before, but this time something felt off. The air was unusually heavy, the sky a deep, bruised purple that seemed to press down on everything. I figured a storm was coming, but I had deadlines to meet, so I kept driving. Around midnight, I decided to pull over at a rest stop I'd never noticed before. It was set back from the road, hidden behind a thick line of trees. The sign was old, barely readable, but I was tired and needed a break. I parked my rig and stepped out into the chilly night. There were no other cars around, just me and the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. I made my way to the small building that served as the restroom and vending area. The fluorescent lights inside flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. I shook it off as my imagination running wild. After all, I was exhausted. I grabbed a cup of coffee from the vending machine and took a seat on one of the old wooden benches outside. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed a figure standing by the edge of the forest. It was a woman, her clothes tattered and her hair wild. At first, I thought she might be in trouble, maybe a hitchhiker who'd gotten lost. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at me with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. I set my coffee down and walked towards her, calling out again. As I got closer, I realized there was something deeply unsettling about her. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were pitch black, like two voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stared at me with those empty eyes. I stopped a few feet away, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn and run. But I couldn't. It was like I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from her. Then slowly, she raised a hand and pointed towards the rest stop. I turned to look, and that's when I saw them. More figures emerging from the darkness, all of them with those same empty eyes, all of them moving towards me. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I knew I had to get out of there. I turned back to the woman, but she was gone. Vanished into the night like she had never been there. Panic set in, and I bolted back to my truck, my heart pounding in my chest. I jumped into the cab, slammed the door, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the rest stop, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them, the figures standing in a line at the edge of the forest, watching me leave. I drove for hours without stopping, my mind racing with questions. Who were they? What did they want? I tried to convince myself it was just a group of weirdos messing with me, but deep down, I knew there was something more to it, something I couldn't explain. Eventually, exhaustion got the best of me, and I pulled into another rest area, this one well-lit and populated with other truckers. I parked next to a couple of rigs and decided to get some sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those figures, their empty eyes staring back at me. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud bang on my window. I sat up, heart racing, and looked out to see another trucker, a big guy with a beard and a friendly smile. He gestured for me to roll down the window, and I reluctantly did. "You are right, man?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I chuckled nervously and told him about the rest stop, the figures, the woman with the black eyes. I expected him to laugh it off or tell me I was crazy, but instead, his face went pale. "You need to stay away from that place," he said, his voice low and serious. "That rest stop, it's not on any map. It's been closed for over 30 years. People say it's haunted by the souls of those who died in a bus crash back in the 60s. The road was different back then, more dangerous. A bus went off the road, right into those trees. No one survived." I felt a cold knot of fear form in my stomach as he spoke. Could it be true? Could I have stumbled onto some kind of haunted ground? I tried to shake off the feeling, but the memory of those figures, those eyes, wouldn't leave me. I thanked the trucker and tried to get some more sleep, but it was no use. The next morning, I hit the road again, determined to put as much distance between myself and that rest stop as possible. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening. My radio would turn on by itself, the volume cranked up to full blast. I'd hear whispers in the static, faint and distorted, like someone trying to speak to me from far away. I'd see shapes in my mirrors, fleeting glimpses of movement that would disappear the moment I turned to look. And then came the dreams. Night after night, I'd find myself back at that rest stop, the figures closing in on me, their empty eyes staring into my soul. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, convinced they were still out there, waiting for me. I don't drive that route anymore. Hell, I barely drive at all. I've taken a desk job, something safe, something that doesn't require me to be on the road at night. I've worked construction most of my life, swinging hammers and pouring concrete under the hot sun and in freezing rain. There's a certain camaraderie you develop with the guys on your crew when you're out there every day, working your fingers to the bone. But no matter how many years you spend on the job, you never quite shake that uneasy feeling that comes creeping in when you're working on an old site. And the site we were on last winter was the oldest I'd ever seen. We were tasked with demolishing an old factory on the outskirts of town. The place had been abandoned for decades, since the 1970s, I think. It was a towering relic of steel and brick, its windows shattered, its walls covered in a thick layer of grime and graffiti. There were stories about this place. Stories about accidents that had happened when the factory was still operational, about workers who died in machinery malfunctions or from falls that left them broken and bleeding on the factory floor. But what made this place different wasn't just the stories. It was the fact that everyone in town seemed to avoid it like the plague. No one ever came near the old factory, not even the teenagers who usually loved exploring abandoned places. The site had a bad reputation, and I quickly learned why. On our first day, we found something odd. As we were setting up our equipment, one of the guys, Tony, came running over, pale as a ghost. He had been poking around in the back of the factory when he found a strange set of carvings on the wall. There were deep, jagged marks that looked like they'd been made with something sharp. At first, we thought it was just some punk kid messing around, but there was something about those carvings that didn't sit right with me. They looked old, much older than the graffiti that covered the rest of the place. Tony and I decided to take a closer look, and as we did, a strange feeling washed over us. It was like the temperature dropped 10 degrees. I felt a chill run down my spine, and every hair on my body stood on end. The carvings were of strange symbols I didn't recognize, and there was something almost angry about them, like whoever, or whatever, had made them was trying to send a message. We shrugged it off and got back to work, but that uneasy feeling stayed with me all day. Then, as the sun started to set, the machinery started acting up. The excavator stalled for no reason, and the jackhammers stopped working even though they were fully charged. And then there was the noise, a low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from deep within the factory walls. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw the other guys looking around, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" One of them whispered. Before I could answer, the ground beneath us shook, and a loud crash echoed through the factory. We'd all turned to see a section of the ceiling collapse, sending debris raining down onto the floor. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but it was enough to send us all scrambling outside. We decided to call it a day and head home, but as I was packing up my gear, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway of the factory watching us. The next day, I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me, but it was no use. The site felt different, like it was alive somehow, and it didn't want us there. We started tearing down the walls, and that's when things really started to go wrong. Tools went missing, equipment malfunctioned, and strange noises echoed through the empty halls. It was like the factory itself was fighting back, trying to keep us from tearing it apart. Then, one afternoon, Tony went missing. We had been working on opposite sides of the building, and when I went to check on him, he was nowhere to be found. I called out his name, but all I got in response was that same low, guttural rumble I'd heard the day before. Panic set in, and I started searching frantically, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd eventually found him in the basement, huddled in the corner, his eyes wide with terror. He was muttering something under his breath, over and over again, and when I got closer, I realized he was repeating the same phrase. They're still here. They're still here. I managed to get Tony out of there and into the truck, but he wouldn't say another word the rest of the day. He just stared straight ahead, his face pale, his hands shaking. We decided to take the rest of the week off, hoping that a few days away from the site would do us some good. When we returned, things only got worse. The carvings we had found on the wall had spread, covering the entire back section of the factory. And this time, they were dripping with something dark and sticky. It looked like old blood, but that didn't make any sense. None of this made any sense. We tried to ignore it and get back to work, but the atmosphere was tense. Everyone was on edge, and I could feel the fear hanging in the air like a thick fog. Then, just as we were about to knock down the last wall, the ground shook again, harder this time, sending us all stumbling. And then, out of nowhere, the floor gave way beneath us, and we fell into a dark, hidden chamber that none of us knew existed. The air down there was thick and stale, and as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw them, skeletal remains scattered across the floor, their bony fingers clawing at the dirt like they had been trying to escape. I felt bile rise in my throat, and I turned to climb back up, but the walls were smooth and slippery, impossible to scale. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving in the darkness, just out of reach. It slithered across the floor, inching closer and closer, and I realized with horror that it wasn't just one shadow. It was many, all of them moving together, like a swarm of insects. I grabbed the nearest piece of debris and swung it at the shadows, but it passed right through them, like they weren't even there. Panic set in, and I shouted for the others to help, but they were already scrambling up the walls, their eyes wide with fear. I turned to follow them, but I felt something cold and wet wrap around my ankle, pulling me back. I kicked and struggled, but the grip only tightened, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I could feel the cold seeping into my skin, draining the warmth from my body, and I knew that if I didn't get out of there, I'd end up like those poor souls on the ground. With one final burst of strength, I broke free and scrambled up the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see whatever it was that had grabbed me. I just climbed as fast as I could, my hands bleeding from the effort, until I finally reached the top and collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. We left the site that day and never went back. We didn't even bother to collect our equipment. It wasn't worth it. Whatever was in that factory, it was something evil, something that didn't want to be disturbed. I don't know what happened to Tony. He quit the job shortly after and moved out of town. The rest of the crew scattered too, and we never spoke about what happened again.